I'm Michael Bungay Stanier. This is Change Signal. This is the podcast where we cut through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change. If you are a transformational leader and you are looking for modern change mastery, this is where we're building bridges into the future. So let me take you back 32 years. I've just arrived at Oxford University from Australia. I know nobody, but I'm introduced to the Rhodes Scholar community because that's how I got in the door at Oxford. And as with every group, there's some people I like, there's some people I'm not sure if I like them, but one of them invites me to a Canadian breakfast. A Canadian breakfast. I didn't know what a Canadian breakfast was. Now, if you're wondering, it's pancakes and it's bacon and it's maple syrup. But more importantly, it's also where I met Marcella, then my future wife, now my current wife. So, woohoo! And it's where I met Emily Moore, who was the host and therefore is the person who first kind of connected Marcella and me all those years ago. And I've had the pleasure of staying friends with Emily now for 32 years.
That's crazy.
I know, it is. It is crazy. So Dr. Emily Moore is a matchmaker. She probably doesn't get introduced that way very often. More commonly, she'd be introduced by saying this. She teaches engineering leadership at the University of Toronto, and there she's helping engineers not just lead, but also to learn to understand and manage change. She's had a storied career in private industry. She sits on various industry boards. And in short, she comes at the idea of change in a way that is academic, but at the same time practical, and at the same time deeply experienced. So this is going to be a fun and rich conversation. Emily Moore, how are you doing?
I'm good. It's great to see you.
It's nice to see you too. We were having dinner at a great restaurant in Toronto, and you started telling me a little bit about what you teach your students at University of Toronto, kind of understanding systems, mapping systems, drawing systems. And the starting point is actually, which is like, how do we do it now that doesn't really work?
Yeah. If you are a chemical engineer, you learn how to do a process flow sheet. So you've got stuff coming in, mass and energy coming in, and products going out the other side. If you're an electrical engineer, that's electrons. If you're a computer engineer, it's, information, bits and bytes. So we're actually trained to think in systems. But one of the exercises I do in my class is I actually ask the students to represent a system based on your discipline.
Right.
And I have yet to see anybody draw a person when they represent that system. So we have these boundaries. And my own experience in industry was that when you kind of ignore what's outside of the boundaries that you're thinking about, that's when you start to have a lot of trouble.
These annoying people.
Exactly.
They complicate everything. I mean, honestly, running change programs in big organizations would be so much easier if we were moving lumps of mass around rather than dealing with messy, complicated, irrational, confused human beings.
And on the flip side, in industry, right, you have these org charts that say, this is how this organization works. And I worked in a Fortune 500 company that every meeting started with an org chart. And then I moved to engineering consulting in a firm that literally did not believe in org charts.
Right.
And both of them, I very quickly learned it didn't really matter. Like it was, you had to figure out the decision maker, the influence, the relationships. The org chart was really just an HR organization tool.
Yeah, it's an amusing work of fiction, the org chart, exactly. In terms of like, this is how things work around here.
Yeah.
It gives you a clue as to what their titles might be, but it doesn't give you a clue to much else, really.
Yeah.
So if you were teaching me how to draw a helpful system to think about change, where do we begin?
I often start with the students just on what is one thing you would like to see different. So what is the change that you want to see? What isn't working well in the system? And I do this as a very quick exercise in my engineering leadership class where I'll just say, think of something. It could be in your personal life. It could be in your school life. It could be in your work life, something you want to see as a change. And then start to literally just write down, map out, like who are the people or the organizations or the considerations that might influence that change. So you start to draw it out.
Right.
And then what are the connections between those? So in the case of a student who wants to change to exam scheduling, it's not so much my immediate exam timetable, but if If they're saying the exam timetabling system is terrible,
Right.
I want it to get better.
Yeah.
They might start to think about, okay, well, there's the registrar, there's the professor, there's other students, there's the dean's office. We might start to think about those things. I am a very big believer in Post-it notes. And so I literally will have people write down the people, the roles, the whatever it is they can think of, and start arranging those Post-it notes, rearranging them, and then to start drawing lines between them.
In other words, what you're doing is you're starting to sense out, feel out the system. Because what you think you know is not what you know, and it's definitely not all there is to know.
And what I love about that exercise is that they then share it with someone else.
Right.
And often the other person will say, well, what about this organization? What about the engineering society, the student government? You don't have them on there. And they start to see potentially other allies, other people they should go and get more information. So it sort of starts to give them a little bit of a map to explore the system rather than just sort of being the armchair quarterback and saying, everything would be better if it happened this way.
Right.
They start to be able to see how the system might work. As you do that, you will probably decide this one doesn't matter. You might put some aside. You might start to see, oh, I forgot about this, or you can start to sort of think about these different pieces. But it's just a thinking exercise. And I think as a facilitator, I'll prompt people to think about, think about individuals, think about organizations or organizational roles.
What I'm taking away from this is like, there are different classes of things that you might be writing down. So there's individuals, there's groups, there's extrinsic influences like legislation. Are there other types of classes of things that you might want to throw in on your systems map?
I mean, you can start to get a little bit into assumptions or paradigms, like basically kind of those rules. So that's another thing that you can start to get into.
Okay.
The second push that I'll often give, so maybe they've done that first 12, I brainstormed my first 10 to 12.
Yeah.
Then I might push people to, okay, now I want you to think about what are the things that are influencing the other roles and that are influencing those people.
Got it.
So
kind of secondary players.
Yeah, the secondary players.
Right.
And so that might end up where you might get into the people that are setting the regulation, that kind of thing. So that kind of gets to that second level.
And if I'm the exam scheduler, I have a boss called the vice chancellor or something.
Exactly.
And part of what I love about your process is you bring in another person to go, well, what about? And you start finding different things that they might have overlooked. Everybody's got blind spots. Doesn't this all get messy? Particularly for an engineer. I've got all these cliches about engineers that they're like, we like straight lines and we like rulers and we like compasses and we're like, neatness.
Yeah.
I can imagine there being a kind of rising sense of anxiety in the room as people are like, oh my God, you're letting in chaos here. What are you doing?
So I think there's a fine line. And I see system mapping as an iterative process. And so brainstorming down to get to that thing that's messy, but also to use it as an engagement with other people around what matters and what doesn't matter.
Right.
Not being afraid to take things off, or maybe to say, I'm going to keep using this very, trite example, but maybe I'm going to say, you know what, all of the students are represented by the engineering society. So I'm just going to take out sort of different disciplines or different pieces. I'm going to simplify it back. In this kind of mapping, there are iterations because ultimately, and this is where it becomes as powerful as a navigation tool, but it's also quite often powerful as a communication tool.
Right.
And so the idea of this is a process so that you can show someone your thinking and test if your understanding of the system makes sense. And they might be able to point out a relationship, or you might say, I missed this relationship. I hadn't thought about how I could go to NSOC and talk to them about this problem. I had missed that. So I might need to draw a relationship between me and this other part of the system.
I might even go further than you're saying, Emily, and say, look, it's not just a communication tool, it's an engagement tool.
Exactly.
So you're talking about making connections. I tell you what confuses me about that. Not all connections are equal and not all connections are the same. So does that matter, or am I just going, look, if I can find any way that A might connect to B, I'm gonna draw a line?
That's part of the iteration quite often that we'll explore. So we might start to just sort of think about it with, drawing solid lines. We might start to say, maybe these are dotted lines versus solid lines. Because I think you want to think about strong ties versus weak ties.
Yeah.
So we explore that often in the workshops that we do. Eventually, if you really start to think about how is information flowing or decision-making flowing in this organization, you actually might start to indicate direction. So you start to get into the system dynamics, which is like a whole other field on its own, getting into causal loops. Yeah.
It feels like it's now gone from really messy and chaotic to really, really messy and chaotic. Because now I'm kind of going, if I've drawn this on a big bit of paper, there are just dots and lines and names everywhere. It's kind of like one of those photos of a murmuration, which is like, it's just a swirl of energy. How do you help your students be with the chaos, be with the anxiety and ambiguity?
In the course that I do on system mapping, I actually foreground that in a course. The system mapping course is looking at complex or wicked problems. So a wicked problem, there's like an academic definition that I can't recite from heart, but it really means that it is highly complex. There's lots of competing interests, a big aspect of sort of social aspects to the problem. Again, a lot of these sort of interconnecting loops within it. So it is a big spaghetti mess. And some of the academic definitions they even will say it's actually not solvable. Like these wicked problems like climate change, not to say we can't address climate change, we can't make it better, but the idea that there is one answer to this problem is just not realistic. So it's beyond complexity.
Yeah. I mean, I think the academic definition you've given us is a big spaghetti mess. And I think we'll run with that. I think that works perfectly well.
You can tell I came to academics a little later in life.
Which is a blessing for all of us, I am sure. Okay, so you've got the anxiety of looking at a big spaghetti mess.
Yeah.
How do you help people sit with this is probably not solvable, but it is improvable?
So again, I think this comes back to the strength of engineering as in the field. Like, what is their role in trying to address these problems? And the course that I do on this, the objectives I have is to get people more comfortable with ambiguity, more comfortable that they will not be able to come up with the solution necessarily, and therefore not to race to convergence. Quite often when we're teaching design and engineering, people might explore the problem for a class or a day or two, and then they kind of start to converge right away to solving the problem. And there's a lot of, there's a lack of humility in that approach. And so I'm trying to introduce some professional humility, that who are the other experts out there that might have something to share, the other perspectives on this problem that I might need to gain from, whether that's within an organization or within a society.
I want to underline this. Here's what Emily's saying. They start to converge on solving the problem, and there's a lack of humility in that approach. That is so on point. In my book, The Coaching Habit, I talk about staying curious longer and rushing to advice a little more slowly. Curiosity is just a huge change capacity. It's learning how to sit in the ambiguity longer, to let the marination go on for another few minutes before you rush to clarify and condense and decide.
And then how do I help to sort of get at that? And by taking the students through this process over the course of a term, they often will struggle with it. I'll tell them that you're going to present your model at the end, and it's more than just this one little map. You're going to explain to me how you understand the system now after spending a term exploring the system. And that understanding will probably still not be right. And I certainly can't tell you if it's right or not. So it's highly ambiguous, but it's how well are you able to communicate? How did you get there? How clear is how have you refined it? And so we talk a lot about ambiguity. We talk a lot about getting more comfortable. And as they go into professional practice, that's the reality of what most engineers have to do.
It feels like the collection of the stuff, the information, the data, the groups, the people, all of that is effectively doing that well as table stakes.
Yes.
And it's really not easy to do because people underestimate just how many things there are in the system. They might have a gravity that might tug things one way or the other. But once you've got all of that, you're now at the start.
Yes.
And actually what happens now is the exploring the connections and the tensions between these things. That's when the system really comes to life, because that's how you see items in relationship to other items. And that's what gets interesting. So collecting the data, great. Finding good data that you might not have realized was out there, or influences, great. But the real work is how to make nuanced connections.
Exactly. And in sort of the systems thinking literature, they talk about you do the differentiation, you do the relationships, but then you get into the perspectives. So not only thinking about, okay, these two things are connected, but what are the priorities? And this is really important if you're thinking within an organization. You might be mapping something out and thinking about the person from marketing versus the person from engineering versus the person from production. What are their priorities? What are they worrying about? And I think as you start to put those different pieces together, you can start to see some opportunities to communicate what you're trying to make the change for, maybe to come up with more creative solutions that might involve multiple players.
Now, I know Emily's an engineer, but this is not some physics equation, power equals work over time. But power meaning, where does the influence lie? If you're curious to learn more about Emily, she's on LinkedIn and also on her academic page at the University of Toronto. You're talking about mapping the connections, and you shared with us that you start off by drawing a line, and then you go, okay, different iterations, we can start playing with different lines. Some might be dotted, some might be heavier, some might mark a direction. Mm-hmm. What other things are we looking to signify when we map connections?
Power.
Right.
So one of the big things that we'll often be looking at is, I always think back to you as my friend who's the hub. Everything goes back to Michael, right? And all of that influencer stuff around hub networks and hubs.
You need new friends. If that's what you got, you got to upgrade your network badly.
So that hub idea, right? Like that has been talked about a lot about influencing change. It's just as true in anything else. And so if you see that everything goes back to this one piece, you start to realize that and that power may not be that that's the loudest voice in the room. It may be that this is the aggregator of information, or that everything has to pass through this. Right. It may be that for a compliance issue or a regulatory issue, that everything goes back through this. So it actually, sometimes that source of connection may not be the CEO or whatever, everything goes up to the CEO. And so
it might be the executive assistant of the CEO.
Exactly.
And he controls access to her.
Exactly.
And if you can't get on his right side, you're never going to get anything in front of the CEO, regardless of her power to say yes or no.
Exactly. And on the flip side, you might see something that's off with only one connection into the system, and you may realize that, this is, so I worked in water for a long time, and unfortunately, water is often an example of this, where the people that are making the decisions around water usage and the people that are measuring the water usage are often, everything kind of goes down through one or two little points.
Right.
And there's not a lot of interplay between these two separate systems, the environmental regulatory system and the operational system.
Right.
And to change the way that we use water in a plant or an operation actually requires you probably to pull both together. So how do you facilitate that conversation? How do you make that happen? There's been some really nice work done out of UBC where they've done the social network analysis. Right. So you can really start to do some pretty cool diagnosis work with this ultimately as you get more sophisticated.
How do you manage against the tendency that I have of tidying things up? Because it'll make it feel a little neater, a little tidier, a little prettier, a little more rational. But I'm guessing that comes dangerously close to killing the power of the map. So how do you find that balance?
I mean, there's great articles about sort of these crazy system maps that are so complicated that they're unintelligible.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of the map, right? So if the purpose of the map is to understand all of the complex interconnected, you're going to have to live with that, and you're going to need to model it in a more sophisticated way. And you don't probably want to oversimplify. Yeah. But if you're trying to communicate high level to the senior team, then you may think about, how do I boil that down? So I think also being really aware that
what makes this useful?
What makes this useful? And what am I trying to get across? And part of the discipline I'm trying to get people to bring in is, what am I choosing to ignore to simplify this problem? And how might that bite me later? The example I give my students all the time, back to the water example, when we were doing some work developing a new technology, we kind of ignored what happened to the wastewater when it went off the process flow diagram.
Right.
And we didn't consciously think about that. And later, we realized that we had a problem that we had to clean up, but we had completely missed this problem. And so I think, again, this iterative process, thinking about audience as a thinking tool, a communication tool, and then sort of going through these different processes.
How do you help people to see the inflection points in the map? Because, and I'm thinking of one of the interviews I had with Dan Heath, who's got a wonderful book around change. And his two key insights in this book are, one, find the inflection points.
Yeah.
That's quite hard. That's kind of what we're doing here, which is like you're figuring out where the inflection points are in the system. And then load your resources onto that inflection point. Don't half-ass it, kind of commit to putting some stuff there. And it feels like there's an art and a science to actually starting to see where the potential inflection points are.
Yeah.
Is there a way you can teach me to kind of be more astute about that?
Yeah. I mean, Donella Meadows wrote a great article on leverage points, and she kind of classified these. She has like, I think, 12 different types of leverage points.
Yeah, so Donella Meadows does have these 12 leverage points. In the article, which we're going to link in the show notes for you, she ranks them from least to most effective, which is helpful. And also, I wanted to mention an additional resource for you here too, the Change Signal episode with Dan Heath, which digs into a related topic, inflection points.
So part of that, we certainly look for things like hubs, locus of power, that kind of thing. So sort of starting with that sort of simple map that we were talking about. But over the course of this way that I'm teaching people, I challenge them to kind of say, okay, here are the types of leverage points that you might look at.
Right.
She talks about infrastructure, she talks about information, the different pieces.
Yeah.
And sort of doing a quick, I ask my students to pick 3 leverage points to think about how they might use those types of leverage points to make things happen.
Nice.
So again, you can maybe having a list like that to sort of prompt your thinking about what might change.
That's great. We'll find that article and provide a link to it in the show notes.
Great.
Because I think that would be great. So identifying the leverage points, we're kind of moving a little bit beyond the systems mapping here now, Emily, which is to sort of say, so then there's something about having the courage to do something with this map.
Yeah. Yeah.
What have you learned about that?
I want to say my strategy to change has always been to convene the conversation. How do we not necessarily come up with the solution, but convene the conversation that's going to move us along? And so I think when I think about the map, back to your comment about it being an engagement, that might be building it out. But it's also that back to the ambiguity, back to the iterative nature of it, that ownership of it is something that you have to hold relatively loosely.
Nice.
And so the courage is actually to be not the expert, to not be the person
hero.
with the answer.
I'm not the hero.
I'm not the hero, right? And I think I really learned that the hard way when I was working on water, when I was working on sort of diversity pieces. On water, it was easier because the nature of what I was doing in my career, I wasn't the expert. I was convening experts to discuss these problems. But when it came to sort of like trying to deal with equity issues, engaging the organization, I actually think these tools would have really helped me. And I didn't use those sorts of facilitation tools for that exercise.
What would you do now differently to help address some of the resistance that would have shown up to, the work in water or the work on equity issues? How do you now think about resistance?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot. So I kind of was trained in engineering and then trained in technology development. And if you think about that technology development curve, you also think about that early adopters, and at the other end, you get the laggards.
Right.
And I think in technology adoption, quite often we're taught to say, well, don't worry about the laggards. Right. Eventually, they'll either get on or they'll still have a rotary phone, like whatever, like who cares? In change, if you're trying to change a system, you have to pay attention to the laggards because that's where the resistance is coming from. And
that's so interesting.
And I think what I have learned is that not paying attention to resistance or dismissing resistance which is quite often happens,
Yeah.
the people that don't want the thing being built or they
Right.
don't want the change
Yeah.
being made. Not listening to that resistance means that you're either not going to be successful or you're going to have some really painful bumps along the way. And I have come to appreciate the people who vocally resist.
Right.
And that's maybe my own like student politics thing, that takes courage to vocally resist.
Yeah.
I think we often dismiss the people that vocally resist, but if people are saying what they're resisting,
Exactly.
10 people are speaking, there's probably another 100 or 200 that feel the same way, just haven't articulated it, aren't brave enough to stand up. And so there's so much information in why are these people resisting. So again, holding that model of the new system or the new change that we're moving towards loosely enough that I can respond, because often those resistors, there's a leverage point you hadn't seen.
Yeah. That's a really powerful insight, which is like, it's not just plan A, which is to say, screw you to the resistors. You don't understand.
Yeah.
And it's not even just, okay, I have to talk to them just because I've got to co-opt them.
Yeah.
It's actually going, there's wisdom here. Some of them are just like, I hate change, but some of them are going, look, I'm trying to defend something that I think is important here.
Exactly.
And what I love, and I hadn't thought of this before, is there's a leverage point in this resistance. What's the leverage point? How will this help us with the change?
Yeah.
There's quite a radical reframing of it.
Yeah. And I think, what is it that people are trying to protect? One of my colleagues at the university, Cindy Rotman, has done some really nice work at sort of resistance, the concept of leadership in engineering.
Right.
And her point is that resistance is actually a protection sometimes of other aspects, so there's sort of like, we're trying to make sure that we're not letting go of some of the things that are the power of and I don't mean power in a, like hitting things over the head kind of way, but sort of what we do really well. And so how do we not water down? What are we protecting by that resistance? And the work that she's done, she's looked at how reframing the way we have been talking about leadership and engineering to something that's really professionally relevant, deeply contextualized, has actually enabled way more people to get involved in the conversation and participate, and has really shifted.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do we still need to say about mapping a system that we haven't yet covered?
So I personally have been sort of struggling with the sort of the inner engineer, which is to sort of model something perfectly. And now that I'm in academics, I'm thinking about like, oh, if we're going to do this work, we have to get it like, we have to have something we can publish, right?
Right.
And then what is it good enough as a thinking tool?
Yeah.
And so I think the power in this for me, and if I put this in leadership, leading change, influencing change, the power in this is in the thinking tool and the engagement tool. There's a place for a really rigorous modeling of the life cycle impacts of something. But there's also that kind of back of the envelope. Or I think of you and your napkins in your earlier books, right? The back of the napkin, right? That kind of picture storytelling communication is so powerful. So not feeling like it's not legitimate if it's Post-it notes and markers.
I love that.
I think that's the thing that creative thinking tool. Later, yes, we or someone else might build the really detailed,
fancier thing,
quantifiable model, but that is not the first step. And you may never need to get to that step depending on the change you're looking to do.
Part of Emily's genius, I think, is she brings all the rigor of a highly trained, highly experienced, highly professional engineer, and she brings storytelling and Post-it notes and markers and kind of an artistic perspective as well. I think it's a really compelling combination. Now, thanks for being with me as I sit down and figure out modern change mastery by drawing connections between things, just like Emily's suggesting. I appreciate your encouragement and your support. It is really helpful when you share a favorite Change Signal episode with a fellow transformational leader. So if there's people you know who should be listening to this podcast, please tell them. Word of mouth is the very best way we grow. You'll find the newsletter and more at thechangesignal.com. Thanks for doing the work. I'm glad you're here.